So I am Dr. Madeline Shell. I am a psychology professor at A&M Central Texas, and I am a developmental psychologist, which means that I study children and adolescents and even young adults. My research focuses on social and emotional development, and particularly how school transitions, such as the transition to high school and college, influence these things. So my goal for today is to talk a little bit about what we as developmental psychologists know about adolescent development and have you think about kind of how this might influence you and how accurate these descriptions are of your personal experience. So we're going to talk about a number of factors that might lead teens to make their decisions and how various things might influence those decisions. So start with kind of a reflection question. And so I want you to just think in your head about a time that you made a good decision. Why do you think you made that choice? Do you think that previous experiences may have influenced the decision you made? Did your peers or your friends influence that decision? Did parents or teachers play a role? Think about all those different things that go into decision making for you. Now, I also want you to think about a time that you made maybe a not so great decision. So how did these same factors influence your decision? Was it the same factors? Was it different factors? We'll talk about the way various factors might influence our decision making. Okay, so one major aspect of kind of development that we focus on is biology. And in particular, when we're looking at psychology, we're looking at how does your brain change. So I'm not going to go into great details about the brain, but there's a few really important areas that are changing during high school, and they can kind of form the foundation and explain some of the other factors we're going to discuss. So first is the amygdala right down here. And the amygdala is part of the limbic system that is associated with emotions. And in the teenage years, we tend to have really strong emotions. And that is in part because the amygdala is developing sooner than some of the other areas of the brain that help us regulate our emotions. And one of those areas that helps us regulate our emotions is what's called the prefrontal cortex, which is located in kind of the front of your brain. And so the prefrontal cortex is involved in reasoning, decision-making, self-control, and things like that. And so what's happening in the teenage years is that your amygdala is developing very quickly, so you may experience very strong emotions, but your prefrontal cortex doesn't finish developing until your early 20s. So you might not necessarily have the resources to control those emotions that you're feeling, and you might not quite have mastered the skills of understanding other people's emotions. The area of the brain that is still developing in the teenage years is called the corpus callosum. So our brain is kind of split into two halves, and the corpus callosum is a bundle of fibers that connect the two sides of our brain. And the more communication there is across the two sides of your brain, the more quickly you can think and solve problems. And so that the development of that corpus callosum helps you get faster at thinking as you get older. So differences between adolescents and adults is that adolescents tend to exhibit more risk-taking behavior. So younger adolescents from ages 14 to 16 tend to show a preference for immediate rewards as opposed to delayed gratification. But then as you develop more impulse control, this steadily declines. And we see one of the things that we see happening is that there's an increase in dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter in your brain, which drives this attraction to novel or new and exciting experiences and this attraction to sensation seeking. And so in the past, teenagers have kind of been depicted as being reckless and fearless, but what we find is that's not actually the case because teenagers are not just generally reckless. When they have information about the risks, when the risks are known, then adolescents actually take fewer risks than children. So it's not necessarily that brain deficits make adolescents do risky things. Instead, what's happening is as a teenager, you have less experience to kind of build your decisions off of, and you want to explore new things. So this is what tends to lead to kind of an increase in maybe risky behavior because you don't have that knowledge to help base your decisions off of. And kind of simultaneously, you are continuing to develop increased cognitive control as your prefrontal cortex develops. It just develops a little bit slower. So if you think back to that question about making good or bad decisions, if you maybe made a not so great decision and can't quite put your finger on exactly what made you make that decision, some of the contributing factors could be this brain development. It may have influenced it. Another biological component that might influence your behavior and your decision making is sleep. So adolescents need an average of 9 hours and 25 minutes of sleep a night. So you might do some kind of mental calculations and think about if you're actually sleeping that much. What we know is that most adolescents are not getting enough sleep. They're not getting that target amount, which means to sleep debt. Every single night, you're not quite getting the amount of sleep you need, which can lead to kind of chronic grogginess. One of the reasons for this is because of the hormone melatonin. So you may have heard of people taking melatonin to help you sleep. Melatonin is kind of a natural chemical that your brain releases, and it helps prepare your body for sleep. And what we know is that melatonin is secreted an hour later in older versus younger adolescents. So your body may get tired and get ready for sleep later than it used to. However, you're still expected to get up early and go to school, but you went to bed, you didn't get tired until an hour later. So this leads to kind of this sleep debt, which we know has been associated with missing school, being late, a lack of attention in school, because it's really hard to pay attention and focus on academics if you are exhausted. We also see kind of this interesting phenomenon where schools are actually kind of catching on with this, and more school districts are implementing later start times. And there is some evidence that if we let our adolescents sleep in late, they do better in school. So for example, a 30-minute delay in school start time has been associated with improvements in sleep, alertness, mood, and health. And what seems to be happening is adolescents don't go to bed any later when school starts later. That kind of bedtime is often kind of driven by their biological clock, but what they do is when school starts later, they sleep later. And so it can be, a genuine struggle, and there are biological reasons why you may have a hard time going to bed early enough, but you can kind of decrease sleep debt by catching up with your sleep on the weekends if you're able to sleep in on the weekends. Another factor that might be influencing your sleep is cell phones. So we know that blue light emitted by cell phones can cause problems with sleep. So blue light, which comes from natural sunlight, but also is emitted by screens, what it does is it blocks melatonin, and so it stops us from feeling sleepy. So when we're doing things like using screens in bed right as we're trying to go to sleep, it can interfere with our body's natural sleep cycle, makes it difficult to sleep at night, and makes it more tired in the day, makes us more tired in the day. So there are kind of natural biological reasons why adolescents might not be getting enough sleep, but there might also be some things we can do to change the amount of sleep we're getting or help us go to sleep more easily. Right, next, we're going to talk about cognition, which is thinking. And so a lot of what we know in developmental psychology about kind of thinking and cognitive development is based on a man named Jean Piaget. And basically, he believed that as we progress through childhood and adolescence, we have different ways of understanding the world in different stages. So in infancy, we kind of understand the world through what we can see and touch. As we get older, we develop language and symbolic thought, and we start to be able to reason logically. And so we can reason with the things that we can see and touch, but we aren't very good at abstract thinking. As we get into the teenage years, we enter a stage that Piaget called formal operation stage. And so here, you're really able to reason with abstract or hypothetical constructs. So you can engage in kind of hypothetical situations and possibilities and reason logically about them. And you're better able to do what we call scientific reasoning. So you can solve a problem and test solutions systematically so that you can develop a hypothesis and test one variable at a time. And this is something that younger children are not cognitively able to do. You also get better at what we call metacognition, or thinking about your own thought processes, so you can become aware of the thinking processes that you are going through. We can also look at social cognition, which is how you think about yourself and other people. And so social cognition we define as the ways individuals conceptualize and reason about their social worlds, and there are changes in social cognition in adolescence too. So just take a second and think about, how often have you thought about a mistake that you made? You said something silly, or you gave the wrong answer in class, and maybe you go home and you're still thinking about how embarrassing that was, and you can't believe you made that mistake. Think about how often someone else has said something incorrect or wrong or silly. Are you still thinking about their mistake hours later? I would guess no. And so what we see is that adolescents have what we call adolescent egocentrism, where they tend to have heightened self-consciousness. You are very aware of yourself, and you might think that other people are thinking about you more than they actually are, which can cause kind of concern and stress over other people's opinions that maybe isn't necessarily warranted. So two specific things we see happening in adolescence. We have this imaginary audience, which is a fear that other people are as focused on you as you are. So again, that's that example of you say something silly or give the wrong answer in class, and then you're thinking about it hours later, and you assume other people are as well, but they probably aren't. Another thing is personal fable. So this is kind of the assumption that you are completely different from everyone else, and no one else can really understand what you're going through. So you and your friend have a fight, and you just don't believe that your parents can possibly understand what it feels like. And so both of these things are associated with kind of how we think about other people. Okay, the next category I want to talk about is self-esteem and emotion. And so we're going to talk about a couple of things within here. One of the things I wanted to mention was that there are pretty substantial changes in self-esteem across adolescence. So self-esteem is kind of how we evaluate ourselves. So globally, do we generally see ourselves as positive or negative? We can break it into subscales. So, you can evaluate yourself on physical appearance or intelligence or things like that. But for now, we're looking at overall. And what you can see is we have these declines in self-esteem kind of at the school transitions, as we transition to middle school, and then again when we transition to college, and even kind of as we transition to high school, we tend to see these dips. We also see that females tend to have lower self-esteem than males. But what you also see is, although you may be experiencing a low self-esteem now, as we get into kind of the mid to late 20s, self-esteem tends to increase for kind of most of adulthood. So these dips are generally temporary, but they go along with kind of some of the changes in expectations as you're coping with kind of transitions, school transitions and things like that. They can lead to negative self-evaluations. So again, low self-esteem in adolescence is mostly temporary. There are certain ways that we know can increase self-esteem as well. So some of the biggest things to do to increase self-esteem is, one, to seek emotional support and social approval. And the other is to improve achievement and help cope with problems. Often when we have kind of the biggest hits to self-esteem, it's when we feel like we are not very good at something we think is important. So if we really value having high quality friendships, and yet we keep struggling with our friendships, that's going to be where we really have a hit to self-esteem. And so identifying ways to improve those domains that are important to you, getting extra support from an adult or a teacher or a friend, getting extra coaching if it's an athletic ability, those things can really help to improve those temporary dips in self-esteem. Okay, we're also experiencing a lot of emotional changes. So remember, we talked about that amygdala developing earlier than some of the other areas of the brains that help you regulate it. In addition, kind of change in hormones lead to changes in emotions. And so we do know that adolescents tend to have more emotional highs and lows than their parents, for example. So you're experiencing more emotional fluctuations. But throughout adolescence, you also develop more emotional competence. So you become more aware of your emotional cycles. You have improved abilities to cope with emotion. You get a better understanding of how your emotional expression influences yourself and other people. So we define peers as individuals who are the same age or maturity level. So of course, you're sitting amongst your peers right now. And peers provide really important information about the world outside of your family, and as I'm sure you've experienced, become more and more important as you go through adolescence. And there's a number of positive impacts from peers. So peers help you learn about fairness and justice as you work through disagreements. They help you learn how to become skilled and sensitive partners in intimate relationships. As you figure out your friendships, you're also figuring out romantic relationships. And they also help you learn about conflict resolution. When you're experiencing conflict with a parent or sibling, there's normally a power differential, and those power differentials are a little less clear among peers. Peers also can sometimes have negative impacts. So rejection from peers or neglect has been associated with poor subsequent mental health. So these peer difficulties are real and can have long-term impacts. Peer culture can kind of undermine parent values or might conflict with what you've learned from your families. And so this can create a tension as you're trying to figure out who am I and how do I fit in with my peers and how does that fit in with what I learned from my family? Peer pressure is another important component of peers, especially in adolescence. And often adolescents are kind of trying to figure out who they are in terms of their identity. We already talked about kind of this lower self-esteem. You're trying to figure out where you fit in with the world and where you fit in with school. And so adolescents are particularly prone to kind of be influenced by their peers, especially if they're in the presence of someone who's higher status or maybe more well-liked or more popular. They may be inclined to conform to peers. And I think it's also worth noting that we're seeing kind of changes in these peer relationships where peers are not just influencing you at school anymore, they're also influencing you on social media and outside of school online as well. Okay, so the final thing that I wanted to talk about was coping. Coping has to do with managing difficult circumstances and trying to kind of figure out those problems or stressors that you may experience. And one of the biggest things we know about successful coping is the most successful coping is flexible. So the same coping strategy might not work in every single situation. We need to be flexible to be effective. There's two general types of coping that in psychology we kind of break it down into. Problem-focused coping has to do with kind of analyzing the situation and trying to change or manage the situation. So you have college applications coming up and are overwhelmed by all the things you have to do for them. So in order to deal with that, you break down all the tasks you need to do and put it on your calendar and figure out how you're going to do that. So problem-focused coping, dealing directly with the issue, is the most effective when it's something that you can control. Preparing for a test or things like that. Emotion-focused coping really is about kind of changing the emotional impact of a stressor. So this might involve things like getting social support or kind of challenging your thoughts. So kind of confronting unhelpful thinking patterns, things like practicing self-care or kind of trying to do something that you think is important, like volunteering to help others to kind of tap into your best self. And emotion-focused coping is really good for when we can't control the situation. We're trying to deal with, our parents getting divorced or a conflict with a friend that you don't really feel like you have, the power to control, or maybe a friend moving away. Those kinds of situations that can be really big stressors, but we cannot control. So there's no single best coping strategy. Really, the most effective way to deal with this is to figure out a coping strategy that works for you. Try it. If it doesn't work, shift to a different coping strategy. Okay, so I'm curious on your thoughts. Did we get it right? Do these things that we talked about kind of resonate with you? And I've got a few activities planned for you to help you think a little bit more about some of the things that we've discussed. I've got my contact information here, so feel free to contact me if you have any more questions.